How you
Hey,
going?
I'm right, thanks. How are you?
Good, good. How's the pandemic working out for you?
Um, not too bad. I'm grad student, so I'm pretty much sitting home all day anyway.
Right.
So not too different. How about you?
It was very hard at the start, but now teaching has finished and it's become easier.
Right, good, good,
Yeah.
very good. Okay, Michael, you with us?
Yes, I am. Hi, Siobhan. Hi, Kramer.
Oh, Michael, how are you going?
Good, and yourself?
Good, good. Are you expecting other people?
Not so. We're just doing through a webinar, so most of the people coming are like not going to be showing up,
Okay.
but just be us.
So we've got 15 attendees tuning in at the moment.
Okay. Are they listening
and
to us talking now?
yes, they're watching, and I think we had about 40 something people register for tonight. So I'm sure some more people will join in as we go.
Yep. We'll also be recording this and putting it on our YouTube channel, so other people will be watching there. And also, just for anyone watching this, you can put in your questions and stuff like that, but we won't read your name out, and you can put it in anonymously anyway, so don't worry about that. And when you do put your questions in, please use the Q&A function down the bottom. It's just easier for us. Okay, and we're also recording this now. Good. So maybe we'll just get started then. So first of all, thank you, Siobhan, for coming or, attending, whatever, digitally, this thing. So Siobhan is a political theorist at UNSW. She does work on quite a lot of different things, including sort of animals and politics, animal ethics, as well as environmental ethics and other things like that. She is going to be talking to us today about sort of animals' place in politics. And she also has a podcast that she has. Is this weekly? Yeah. Knowing Animals, which deals with a whole range of different issues related to animal ethics, animals and politics law, activism, things like that. So if you're interested, go check that out. That's Knowing Animals. Okay, so thanks again, Siobhan, for coming to talk. So I'll just let you sort of do your talk now, and then we'll have Q&A for a bit. We'll sort of see how long the whole thing goes, but we probably will stop at 9 if it takes, if we get to then. If not, we'll just stop whenever. Stop.
And Kramer, how long would you like me to speak for to start with?
Sort of up to you. I mean, you can keep it short, or you can probably no longer than 35. But shorter than that's fine if you want to keep it brief.
Wonderful. Okay, well, will I get going?
Sure.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's a real pleasure. It's a thrill to be asked, and I hope what I have to say is of use. So in thinking about what I was going to discuss today, I just came up with a bit of a list of, topics. I'm happy to lead off with the things that I thought might be most relevant. But I think with these kinds of formats, I do honestly think that probably the Q&A is the most interesting bit, because a lot of my thoughts you can get from elsewhere, such as my books and journal articles. That said, they're probably terribly tedious to read, and it might just be easy to hear me say off the cuff what I think. So I was asked to say something about the place of animals in our political system. And for me, whenever I start to think about animals and politics, my mind always goes back to the start. And that really is around the 1820s in Victorian England, where we started to get our first animal welfare laws. And the reason why I always go back to that point is that something really special happened at that time, which has influenced all the laws that have come since. And what it was this development of this notion of unnecessary suffering. And the idea is that it's not okay to cause animals to suffer unless there's a reason why that suffering is thought to be necessary. And it's that contestation over what is necessary that really underlines all the political really dispute and challenge and debate within a mainstream political culture. So in the couple of 100 years since that first animal welfare law was drafted, which is often referred to as Martin's Act, almost every kind of Westminster influenced animal welfare law has followed that same pattern. And so the principle is that it's not okay just to sit at home and beat your dog because you enjoy beating your dog. That's not okay. That's not a necessary kind of suffering. But it is okay to house animals in battery cages, to have pigs in sow stores, because that is necessary. That's necessary to the extent that it's how you produce a lot of eggs very cheaply with very little labour. So this idea of what constitutes necessary and unnecessary suffering is really the central place in which people who are concerned about animals and who want to make the laws better do a lot of their debate, and a lot of the contestation takes place. And I think it is fair to say that in the couple of 100 years since Martin's Act, what is construed as necessary has changed. So one of the first challenges to Martin's Act was around things such as bull baiting. Is it okay to, use bulls for sport? Is it okay to do things such as tying firecrackers to bulls' horns and chasing them down the street? And those kinds of activities have been progressively phased out. They have been over time deemed unnecessary. So there has been progress in that way. That said, the cynic in me is mindful of the fact that a lot of what does get prohibited are things that don't also make economic sense. So if you're running a community, or you have a city, or you have a town, having bulls running around like crazy while people watch them and interact with them is not a good way to do commerce. It's destructive. So it's not necessarily always because it benefits the animals. It might benefit something else. But I think it is fair to say that this notion of what is and is not necessary has changed over time. But what hasn't changed over time is, I think, the fundamentals of how we perceive animals, how we create laws for animals, how we interact with animals. So there's a lot of different, literature and people thinking on these topics, and I'm really happy to go into more detail on anything that's particularly interested to people watching and listening. But one of the great debates that happens within animal protection is this notion of, should we be fighting for improvements within this conceptual structure of necessary suffering, or kind of an animal welfare framework, or should we be pushing for something that's really revolutionary, that changes the very nature of the way in which human and non-human animals interact? And so, for instance, some people say what we should really be pursuing is rights for animals. And if animals had rights, it would challenge this idea that some types of harm are okay. Now, these stronger claims, these kind of real revolutionary ways of thinking about animals and restructuring our relationship with animals, so far to my mind, haven't really gained a great deal of political traction. One thing that I think it is fair to say has changed is that increasing numbers of people report greater affection for companion animals, and just as a kind of a rhetorical, language mechanism, I think probably more people would say that they believe in animal rights. But when that concept of rights means a very strong protection from harm, even when that harm is perceived to be beneficial, or indeed is in actual fact beneficial, that I don't think we see reflected in animal welfare laws. So I guess the picture I'm painting is one in which we laid down this very, very strong conceptual structure in the 1820s. We have been able to make some gradual progression in terms of the detail of which animals are protected under which circumstances, because we've been able to adapt our thinking of what we think is necessary. But we're yet to have a really significant breakthrough in terms of fundamentally challenging the kind of dominant, often harmful relationship that humans have with animals. So when I think about animals and politics today, a few things come to mind. One is that, the first thing to say is that the foundation of something like the Animal Justice Party, and also the ability to get people elected into Parliament, is really fantastic. It's a big achievement. I was not at all convinced that the AJP would be able to get people elected to Parliament when the idea was first floated, but clearly I was wrong. And indeed, having things like the Young AJP folk who are coming together to think about animal issues, I think is also a great advantage. We also have animal welfare policies within the mainstream political parties, which perhaps speaks to at least a mindset or a tendency towards being interested in animals. But I think despite those achievements, sizable challenges persist. I think one of them is that when we vote, we tend to vote on a very narrow range of issues, and that narrow range of issues seemingly for most people doesn't include animals. And it doesn't include lots of other things that matter greatly. So really it seems to be, we have got this 2.5 party system. Really, for most of us, we're going to choose between Labor or Liberal, and perhaps in some circumstances, the Greens are viable. Perhaps in some circumstances, someone from the National Party is viable. And perhaps in the upper house, we're thinking about the Animal Justice Party or the Greens or whatever else. But at the end of the day, the issues that people vote on tend to be overwhelmingly around the economy and education and healthcare and that kind of thing. So I think breaking out of that, putting animals on the political agenda in a way that is related to voting behaviour, I think is a big challenge, and something that we still need to do better on. The other thing that I think is a challenge facing people who are concerned about animals at the moment is, it seems to me that ag-gag laws are becoming more prominent. I have just completed a paper that's been accepted for publication in the Australian Journal of Political Science, so hopefully it'll come out fairly soon, and it's about ag-gag and freedom of speech. So ag-gag is very much on my mind at the minute, I have to admit, because I've just been finalising this paper. But I think ag-gag really does pose a threat to the animal protection movement. I think that the animal protection movement in Australia and around the world is resilient and creative, but it certainly makes it more challenging in many ways. So I think domestically, ag-gag is problematic. When I think about animals and politics, the other thing that I think is a really sizable challenge is, I think that animal meat production, so the production of meat from animals, i.e. factory farming, is going to increasingly be moved offshore, increasingly to China, and China doesn't have any animal welfare laws, none that kind of deal with purpose-bred animals and the conditions of confinement and that kind of thing. And I think even among people who hold a radical animal rights position, I would think that probably there would be a consensus that it's not in the animal's best interest to find themselves in a factory farm within the context of a country that has no animal welfare laws. I think we can also expect meat consumption will increase as people are lifted out of poverty and they start to emulate the things that we've been doing in this country and elsewhere, which are very problematic for animals. But at the same time, I don't think it's all doom and gloom, because I think another trend that we can observe is that many people are stepping outside of formal political structures and trying to do their best for animals as consumers rather than citizens, or perhaps both. I mean, I think for many people, they love being a citizen and they exercise their rights as citizens every time they vote, but they hold the view that their power as a consumer is more significant because they are consuming regularly. You know, every time, on one reading of it, every single meal we have is a political act, and if you choose not to eat animals, you're doing something political, and it's also good for animals. I had a 7-Eleven sandwich for lunch today. It's a very unusual happening for me, but I had the no chicken sandwich. It was really nice, actually, really nice. So I do see that as a great source of optimism, along with the success of the Animal Justice Party. I don't have any desire to be, you know, the bringer of doom and gloom. But that said, I'm sure you appreciate my honest perspective. And I think with something like the Animal Justice Party, the next question is, what would the animals say? And I think about that myself as an academic. You know, I've been working as an academic for a decade and a half, much of which has been dedicated to thinking about animal issues. I have my podcast. Again, I'm trying to help make the world a better place for animals. And, you know, if you asked your local sow and a sow store if they're aware of my work, I'm sure they'd say no, because in many ways, conditions haven't changed. Change is very slow, and there's still a very large number of animals suffering. So when I keep looking to the side because I wrote myself a little list of things to say. I feel as though I've gone quite quickly, but I've covered over the main points that I thought to open the conversation with. So maybe now is a good time to start the Q&A if people want me to elaborate on points or talk about different things.
Sure, that's excellent. Thank you, Siobhan, for that. So we'll just do Michael. I'll do one, then you can do one, or something like that. So one question here is, I guess, so can you speak at some point on how the situation with COVID-19 can be leveraged to highlight animal rights issues?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I have started a little list of animal winners and losers as a result of COVID-19. When I started it, I was perhaps feeling a little bit optimistic, and, you know, I've been seeing footage of, you know, goats frolicking in English countrysides, and I thought, oh, maybe there is good news. But unfortunately, the negative list has become very long, and it's not clear to me that it is going to be a great thing for animals. I believe that there are moves to deal with things such as wet markets and the consumption of wildlife in China. I hope it's true, but we have heard it before, and I think enforcement is the big challenge. There is a lot of, you know, I did a fair bit of media around animals and wet markets in China and whatever at the start of the COVID period, and one thing I really wanted to stress, and I want to stress it again here as well, is that in this sense, there's nothing special about China. We are all involved in, to some extent, and certainly I as a child and still to this day are involved in culturally reproducing practices that harm animals, and much of it is around food. And it's very hard to change people's eating practices, particularly those culturally entrenched things around Christmas and, you know, what you do at birthday, you know, you've got to have egg and cakes and all the rest of it. And I think China is in a similar situation. There is a lot of cultural practice around buying animals live from wet markets and things like that, that will be difficult to change. So it will require governmental pressure. That pressure is available to the Chinese government. They have considerable pressure, but whether they will choose to use it or not, I'm not sure. I think from the animals' perspective, the other challenge that we now face with COVID-19 is the use of animals in research. And I think that there is going to be a lot of suffering associated with things like vaccines, medical trials, that kind of thing. So my heart goes out to all the animals who are going to find themselves involved in research protocols.
Right, thank you.
Okay, Siobhan, so we've got a question here, and I'll just before I ask it, I'll remind people, if you could put the questions if you click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and put them in there instead of the chat, just makes it a little bit easier for us to keep track of them and ask the questions. But that's fine, I'll ask this one. So it's about ag laws coming from big, powerful companies. They lobby government, they're quite powerful at influencing government policy. And the question is asking about, does this mean that that the animal rights movement needs to critique capitalism, or how do you see the intersection between lobbying, animal activism, animal rights, and capitalism?
Yeah, look, that's a really interesting question, and I do think it's a complicated issue. I am very aware that there are a lot of people out there who take what they might describe as a critical animal rights perspective, or in my world of academia, they might refer to themselves as critical animal studies. And that is a very, it's a position that's extremely critical of capitalism. And if that is something that you're interested in, there are plenty of people that you can read and engage with who do that kind of research and that kind of thinking. A colleague of mine, Dinesh Wadiwal, is someone who I'd suggest you start with. He is, I think it's fair to say, he's extremely critical of capitalism, and he's very passionate about animal issues, and he makes those connections absolutely. I myself am not of that ilk. I believe in liberal democracies, and they have grown up with capitalism. The version I'm interested in is a version where the state is strong and it uses its power to protect animals. So I'm interested in, I guess you might call it a bit more of a socialist model, but I am in favour of liberal democracies. My view is that there is something extremely problematic about the way we treat animals, and it often comes down to money. But I look around the world at, economies and political systems that are not liberal democratic, that at least on the face of it eschew capitalism, and I still see a lot of animal suffering. So I'm not persuaded that capitalism or opposing capitalism will end in nirvana for animals. I think there are plenty of animals that are being harmed in a whole range of contexts that are not capitalist. That said, I've got nothing against people who wish to be highly critical of capitalism and link it to animal suffering. There's no question that the money motivation is very closely linked to a lot of animal suffering. I think that we can choose to oppose activity even when it's financially beneficial if we want to protect animals, and we don't use that power in the right way. But I'm open to people talking about it as a capitalist problem. It's not my view, but I appreciate that it's a legitimate view for some.
Okay, thanks, Siobhan. And I just went and looked. I found Dinesh's research page, so I've put that in the chat there if anyone's interested in looking at any of his work. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, so This question asks, do you think it's possible to get sort of meaningful change for animals within the framework of unnecessary suffering? And if so, can you think of any instances when there has been this sort of meaningful change in our current framework?
Yeah, so I do think that the concept of unnecessary suffering theoretically gives us a whole lot of wriggle room. It really sets up this it sets up a landscape in which we can contest and which we can make claims, and it allows for us to evolve socially. So I don't want to say that this concept of unnecessary suffering or necessary suffering is entirely problematic. I think our interpretation of it is very consistent with our broader values. And I think it is the case that a lot of people like to harm animals. If you eat meat, you harm animals. If you go to a circus with animals, if you go to a zoo, you're engaged in harming animals. So in a sense, it kind of does reflect social values. One of the things that I have tried to demonstrate in my research, and it's in my book, Animals, Equality and Democracy, which is somewhere on the shelf behind me, is that when I started doing my research for my PhD, which then became my book, Animals, Equality and Democracy, the predominant thinking at that time, I think, was that unnecessary suffering is linked to economics. We don't allow people to harm animals when there's no clear economic benefit, and we do allow it when there is an economic benefit. And so one of the kind of parallels that's drawn is the one that I used earlier, which is this idea that you can't just be cruel to your dog at home because you enjoy it, but you can be cruel to hens in a commercial egg-laying farm because that's how you produce cheap eggs. In other words, it's necessary. But what I have tried to show in my research is that while economics is very important, and often the pursuit of money does result in animals being harmed, it's not just economics that can explain the variations we get in animal welfare laws. And there's something else going on. And even if we compare different types of animals that we make money from, we find these variations. And so what I argue is that there's something about the seeing the suffering, the knowing the animal, the being able to observe it and bear witness to it, that results in stronger animal welfare laws. And so, for example, one of the things I show in my research is that the animal welfare laws around zoos have improved much more quickly than the animal welfare laws around factory farms. And so my argument is that if we can see, if we can know, then we are in a position to change. And we can argue that we don't wish to treat animals in this way. So, for example, dog fighting, it was very common at the time Martin's Act was created. It's prohibited now. We prohibit it because even though you can make money from it, we've decided that it is not how we want to treat animals. So I think this leads us to a bit of a puzzle, and this puzzle is kind of at the heart of my bigger research that I've been kind of pursuing for many, many years, which is this idea of how can we have better animal welfare laws when we can't see animals, we can't see how they live and die. And that's where I think animal activists become very important, because they are able to take us inside the factory farms and show us what goes on. And it's also where organisations or political parties such as the Animal Justice Party becomes important, because they can bring that information to a wider audience. They can take it into Parliament, they can share footage, they can help people see what's going on. So I think that we can work within these frameworks to some extent. And where we fail to do so, partly because we've not seen, and partly because a lot of people benefit from being cruel to animals and don't wish to relinquish those benefits that they get.
Right, thanks.
I wish I had better news to share. It can get a bit depressing when you think too hard about it.
So I'm paraphrasing this question a little bit because I want to add my own question to it as a two-parter. So it's about the environmental impact of animal agriculture, in particular the impact on emissions and climate change. So the question is asking about the methane. This question is asking about is this environmental impact highlighted enough in the climate equation? So last year, the 2019 election, federal election, a lot of people were saying it's the climate election. This climate change is one of the main things people are voting on. And do you think that was actually the case? And how do you think that is reflected in how people vote, in particular the environmental impact of animal agriculture?
Look, as far as I can see, we're not thinking about the environment, certainly not adequately when we vote. I wouldn't have thought there would be many third-party observers who would think of the coalition government as leaders in, combating climate change. I think by Australian standards, they're weak, and by global standards, they're terrible. And I think probably the whole world knows it. So it's not at all clear to me that the environment was at the fore of people's minds when they voted. That said, our electoral system, as I'm sure everyone watching knows, is a very kind of, on the one hand, it's a very simple beast, but on the other hand, it's a very convoluted system. So, we don't vote for who our Prime Minister is going to be unless we sit in that electorate. And indeed, I live in Anthony Albanese's seat. He's always going to win. He has been winning forever. So on one level, my vote actually doesn't matter much. So the elections are won and lost on these very small margins in these very particular seats, and then the accumulation of that becomes the government. So perhaps another way to think about it is what was in the mind of those very small number of people in, marginal seats in places like Western Sydney that affected the environment, the vote. I personally don't see it. That said, you've got to be very, I would think it's becoming harder and harder to deny climate change. I think you've really got to have a real fortitude of personality to be of the view that there's nothing to see here or humans aren't involved. So I think history perhaps is going to overtake those people. In terms of the animal question, I think that the environment is terribly important. I think planet Earth is terribly important. I think Earth being livable is important for humans. But I'm not vegan really for those reasons. If they do benefit animals as well, that's fantastic. But I do it first and foremost for animals. That said, I don't think the animals care why it is we don't eat them. I think from the animals' perspective, not being killed and eaten is good, irrespective of the reason. But I do feel a little bit nervous when I think that people are doing something for one reason and then dressing it up according to another because they think that other reason will be more saleable. I think that perhaps is a bit of a risky strategy, only because it's perhaps you're at risk of perhaps becoming undone, particularly if, more environmentally friendly ways of, found to raise animals or whatever else. So I think I've got to I do feel that if you're worried about the environment, you should be vegan, but I don't know if it's the best thing politically, strategically, or even morally, if you're vegan for the animals, to be professing to be vegan for the environment in particular, because you think that'll be more saleable, if that view's of interest to people.
Yeah, it's a good point. One thing I've been worried about, just looking at the US stats, not sure how it relates to Australia, but the number of cows being consumed is going down a little bit, but the number of chickens being consumed is going up a lot. I just worry that because eating chickens, you could argue, is more environmentally friendly, at least in terms of emissions. So maybe if people are caring about that, instead of switching from, say, standard diet to vegan, maybe they're switching from eating cows to eating chickens or something. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Well, PETA, which is a well-known bunch of troublemakers, and I think have fallen out of favour among a lot of people, perhaps particularly because of links to sexism and other things like that. But nonetheless, they did really put the animal protection movement, I think, on the map there for a while. That one of the things that they used to do was go to, like, meetings, global meetings about whale hunting and flyer, and say, eat whale, eat whale. And their rationale was, if we kill one whale, we can feed so many millions of people for so long. And if we have to do that with chickens, it's going to be a lot of lives lost. So it's better to kill one massive animal than lots of little animals. Of course, they were just trying to be provocative, and not many people want to eat whale meat. That's something we know for sure. I care most about the individual animal, and I think there's also a challenge with the animal protection movement and the environmental movement on this question of the individual versus the species. And I really feel that I have to come down in favour of the individual. And I think for a lot of environmentalists, they feel they must come down in favour of the species. And there is the decision made to harm individuals if they think it would be good for that species or another species or whatever else. And I do find that morally problematic. And I also think that that is one of the issues that is very difficult to resolve. A lot of people have tried to find a way through it. It's very, very hard though. And I myself am never going to, I think, come to the conclusion that individuals don't matter and all that matters is your species, protecting your species. But some people do.
Okay, thank you. Kramer?
So I suppose this question relates to what you were saying before about, your work on how visibility is very key to getting change for animals. So the questioner asks, what do you think, needs to happen to get people to change their thinking about the sort of rights animals deserve? So presumably visibility would be part of it. Do you want to expand on that, or any particular things you want to say on that? Or
yeah, I think it is such a. I think if I knew the answer to that, I think I would have the only answer I need, and I don't know the answer. And as a result, I don't have the only answer I need. Certainly when you talk to a lot of animal advocates and, you can hear people, if you're interested in listening to my podcast, Knowing Animals, there's plenty of episodes with animal advocates, and I always ask them about their history and what brought them to it and all the rest of it. And a lot of people say, I thought once I found out, I thought I could tell others, and once they knew, they would stop. And it just doesn't happen. I mean, I think probably most people on this call would have quite a few people in their lives, important people, grandmothers, nieces, neighbours, school friends who eat meat, who know and still do it. And it's on one level it's unimaginable. But then when I think about myself and the harm that I knowingly do to future generations, for example, the harm that I do to people in the developing world through the way I purchase things, etc., I think to myself, this is how it happens. So so then people, around my work with visibility, people say, well, how can you say this problem is invisible? Because activists have been exposing these conditions inside factory farms for decades now. And I think that there is something about the knowing in a very immediate, direct sense that I think is important. So, for example, if I had to walk down the street and actually see the children who work in the sweatshops in Asia making clothes that I buy, I think I'd be less likely to do it than if it's all invisible, out of sight, out of mind. So I think there is something about not just knowing and being aware of it, but actually seeing it in front of you. But then people also do terrible things. I mean, people commit, war crimes and ethnic cleansing and rape, and so I don't have the answers. I really do think that perhaps the world is getting more peaceful overall, but I don't know how to improve it quickly. I don't know. I wish I did. If someone knows, they can let me know.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, just in that last part you said, I think Steven Pinker makes the argument that the world is getting less violent and better for humans overall, but that certainly doesn't seem to be the case for non-humans, at least not at the moment, unfortunately. So Siobhan, what do you think about food-based, plant-based food tech, cellular agriculture, and those kind of other technologies around food that might be changing the way that we eat?
I think that they are possibly good. I've got nothing against them. I think I was in the UK on sabbatical about 2 years ago now, and there was a lot of talk about lab-grown meat and that kind of thing, and a lot of people doing research on it and thinking about it. If you're after some research on it, you could look up Josh Milburn. He's he's at the University of Sheffield, and he's doing some research on it. The view that I think he formed and that I guess was imparted to me was this idea that it's not for vegans. It doesn't matter for me. I myself don't have a need for cultured meat. I do eat mock meat. I'm not against mock meat. I don't eat it regularly because I suspect it's not very good for me from a kind of a sodium and calorie-rich perspective. And it's also one of the reasons why I think vegans have to be a little bit cautious, because I also don't know that it's great environmentally. I think it's a very refined food that probably takes a lot more energy to produce than, your slab of tofu or whatever else. That said, I do enjoy it. If I'm at a restaurant or whatever else, as I said, I had this 7-Eleven sandwich experience today. If it can make it easier for some people, for other people, then why not? I'm not opposed to it. If animals aren't being harmed and if it's safe to eat, then it's absolutely fine with me. That said, there's great food out there that doesn't require mock meat. Really a lot of very, very nice meals just involving plants or lentils or dal and all the rest of it. One thing I'm not so into is people who aren't vegetarian or vegan telling me that mock meat's a bad thing, or when I eat vegetarian I eat salads. Well, you're not vegetarian though, are you? Having one salad a year doesn't put you in a good position to tell me how I should be eating. So what do I think? I'm optimistic that they might make things better for some people. But, there's a world of cuisine out there. So, if you've been to the Sydney vegan market, it's a calorie nightmare. There's so much food on offer there, everything you could imagine, and the cupcakes. So it's actually, in my view, not that hard to produce really tasty food that's vegan and whatever it takes.
If I could just, if you to get you to expand on that a little bit, do you think then that because that stuff is already out there, that some of this plant-based food tech and cell ag won't make that much of a difference if like there's pretty good alternatives out there already, and then obviously like a very large percentage of the population is not going for these most of the time. What do you think about that?
Look, I'm not sure how it's going to play out. I have been making a sausage roll for decades that I reckon if you dip it in tomato sauce, particularly if you smell it hot and dip it in tomato sauce, it's indistinguishable from an actual sausage roll. Now, I've said that about quite a few things and people look at me as though I'm crazy, but this one, the smell of the pastry, I use a Frankfurter style sausage in the tomato sauce. No one would have a clue. It's a real hit at parties. I take it around, everyone loves it, blah. So there are already some very persuasive alternatives out there. There are some things that are horrible. Cheese, we've been struggling with cheese. Oh my goodness. There are some cheeses that are getting better, but there are some that you can buy that, there've been cheeses on the market for a decade now that are as close, as good as inedible, and you just can't offer them around. And so perhaps if we can get better at these things, more people will be interested. Perhaps some people won't have a choice. They will just be fed the alternatives. That's absolutely fine with me. Maybe it will be in schools, maybe it will be in prisons, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's also about the economics of it. I don't know. I think there's also ritual around barbecues and whole animals that maybe will take longer to challenge. That said, I've noticed over the years a lot more people claim to eat a lot more vegetarian food than they used to, and there was a time when you really wouldn't expect there to be a vegetarian or vegan option available at a whole range of places, and that's changed, and it must be in response to demand. So if it means less animals are killed, great. The other challenge, however, is of course it's a volume issue with animal agriculture, and there are a lot of animals being killed, and it seems to be increasing, and that's as more people are able to afford and more people are lifted out of poverty, they want meat. But if they can, maybe they can avoid our folly and jump straight to, Fry's schnitzel. I love schnitzel. I put them up against a regular schnitzel. But perhaps not. Perhaps it'll take a while.
Thanks, Siobhan. And I had a Fry's pie for lunch yesterday, actually. It was very good. Over to you, Kramer.
I like fries. Yeah. Not sponsored by them at all.
So this question asks, do you think that there's a country that has a particularly good position on animal rights, or I suppose animal welfare?
No, I honestly don't. I think it depends on what you're after for your animal protection. I think the EU did some really important things at the start, but it is a long time since there's been a win in the EU. So they really were progressive there for a while, still within this context of it's okay to use animals are our resource, but we need to minimise their suffering. But they did make these leaps and bounds, and it's now all stalled. Australia claims to have world-class animal welfare laws to the point where it's essential we export animals live to, you know, the Middle East and elsewhere, because, you know, we've got these great animal welfare laws. I think perhaps there's some aspects to, you know, Australia's animal protection regime that's slightly beneficial to animals, such as perhaps many animals could expect a reasonably quick death. But if that's kind of the best thing you can say about an animal welfare regime, and we're talking about, you know, I mean, the last time I looked it up, there were 4 agricultural animals for every human on earth. I mean, there are slaughterhouses in this country that work all day and all night. We're talking about huge numbers of animals, none of whom want to die. So when you think of it from that perspective, no, Australia is very problematic. We don't have as many really horrible zoos, I don't think, as some other countries. So if you want to be really depressed, there are places you can go and see really terrible zoos. There is a lot of regulatory oversight of animal research, and we're a small country when it comes to research anyway, so less animals dying than in other places. But no, I don't really see, I mean, wherever they're serving meat, there are animals suffering, and that's, I think, the reality of the situation.
Sure, thanks.
So ag laws are a threat to the animal protection movement, obviously, but the questioner is asking, is there a chance that they will end up backfiring for the animal agriculture industry? So perhaps if through less transparency or by the change itself, they lose their social license to operate or something?
I would like to think that's the case. I think that in the US, which is where we get this concept from, there have been serious challenges to them because they've got very good freedom of expression protections. We don't have those same protections. So I think we're in quite a precarious situation. I guess what I think, I'm not sure if they're necessarily going to backfire. I can't quite see that. I hope it is the case, but I think perhaps animal advocates will keep going and they will just adapt, and I think that's probably the most likely scenario. So I don't think we're going to end up in a situation where people decide it's too difficult, let's not worry about it. They will find ways to engage in this activism. I mean, I was just so impressed with, you know, the duck shooting season started, I think it was perhaps last weekend, very recently anyway. And, you know, the activists got this great drone footage showing drug use among the shooters and lack of social distancing. You know, they were able to give that to enforcement authorities. So I think activists are going to continue to be smart and get smarter. I think this is just one more challenge. And you know, those with power who wish to protect their power will always try to find a way to slow down change, and AgAg's an example of that. I don't see us forgetting though that there are animals in factory farms suffering. I think that's enough on enough people's agenda that the contestation will continue.
Thanks.
I might take this opportunity to ask a question of my own. So this is, I wonder if you have any thoughts on sort of diagnosing what happened with the Mike Baird Greyhound ban thing. So it was implemented, then basically it was, you know, overturned. And he sort of left politics very shortly after. So, I mean, I suppose 2 initial thoughts for me were, you know, well, one was did this sort of happen because, you know, he made a legislative change that was, you know, economically non-viable? Or 2, was it because, you know, he made a change that was sort of out of touch with the sort of political will of his voter base? or do you think it was both, or do you think it was something else, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think that so what I have to say is that I've not studied the situation closely. I am aware of it and I have thought about it somewhat, but I've not given it a proper kind of academic, rigorous analysis. But if I was going to, my hypothesis would be, I don't think it's the first one. I don't think that it's not economically viable. I think that greyhound racing contributes little, if anything, to the economy. I think my hypothesis would be, I'd have two that I'd explore first up. The first thing I would have a look at is particular marginal seats and how popular greyhound racing is in those particular key seats. So it could have been that, the politicians are working with such narrow margins now, and if you don't have control of both chambers, it's very, very difficult. So I think at one point I read there was something around people in Orange or at the kind of beyond the Blue Mountains for whom this was a significant political decision, and it was not, they wouldn't wear it. So I would investigate that hypothesis first up, because of course it was banned in other areas. The ACTU did it and it stuck. So there was maybe something about the way the numbers work out in that territory, or perhaps the configuration of their chambers that lent itself to that decision. The other thing I wonder is whether enough was done to bring the community along. And so I remember being really surprised. It happened very quickly, and it was announced, and there, I think politicians do need to consult, or at least word up, or bring constituents along in a way that I don't know what happened in this case. So they would be my two hypotheses that I would examine. I don't know if it is that, but that's what my gut kind of tells me.
Cool, thanks.
This question is sort of topical because we have council elections next year, but do you have any insight for advocating for animal rights within a local council setting? It's a very different set of laws and things that you can change at council level versus state and federal, but what would you see as a good framework for, say, engaging with your local community, encouraging them to care about local politics, in particular for animals?
Well, I would very much encourage you to pursue a local government. I think it's a fantastic way to do things and to grow a party, and I think it's a big part of the Greens' success. Getting in there at the local level, it's both doable, it's important, and it's a great training ground for future politicians and decision makers, etc. So I absolutely encourage that, and it also gets the word out there, and it's good for young people, it's good for the local democracy. Indeed, I get my students to go and watch a local government meeting, and they have to report back on what they see in the debate, and whether they feel they see democracy in practice. Unfortunately, a lot of times they report back to me that the mayor was a real bully and such was in tears, and there was no debate, and it was all very depressing from a political procedural perspective, but that can be changed. I think, I think the big issues at local government level are probably going to be things such as companion animal issues, so off-leash areas, perhaps provision of, desexing, microchipping, that kind of thing, the quality of the local pound, whether it's no-kill. I also think, the animal protection movement has a very long history of getting local governments involved in circus campaigns, so the use of public land in many parts of, for instance, the fringe of Sydney, councils own the only kind of land that's big enough to set up a circus. So ensuring that public land is only used appropriately. I mean, if it were me, I'd be shutting down all urban farms and petting zoos and all that kind of stuff. Absolutely. I mean, goodness, you could have a go at trying to shut down a few meat vendoring markets or something like that. I don't know how popular that'd be, but you could give it a go. So I think it's going to be, yeah, those very local issues. Perhaps also wild animals or free living animal issues might come into play as well, with things like retaining trees and habitat and boxes for possums, that kind of thing. You know, in Melbourne, there's a big history of making trees inaccessible for possums and things like that. I think they're probably local government ordinance, at least in some cases. So a lot of issues. You know, it might be enough though at the local level just to turn up, be a nice person, hand out flyers, be accessible and interesting and young, and you might find people vote for you.
Cool, thanks, Siobhan.
So this questioner says, you've written a number of articles which are based on a survey you conducted of animal studies scholars. They say there are some very interesting things that these articles revealed, and if you might just be able to talk a bit about these articles and what this tells us about women advocating for animals in politics.
Yeah, wonderful. So my main area of research is this kind of democratic gap between animals living in these invisible settings such as factory farms and the role animal advocates play in exposing animal suffering and changing community attitudes and therefore public policy and that kind of thing. But more recently, I've been doing this kind of other project, which is the one that the commentator or the question asker has asked about, which is a survey of animal studies scholars. So we ran the survey. It was myself, Yvette Watt, who might be known to some people on this Zoom interview because she herself has a long history as an animal advocate. She's based in Tasmania. And Fiona Probyn-Ratsey, who's a feminist scholar and a kind of a post-colonial scholar, and is also very interested in animal issues. And we ran the survey in 2015 after attending a animal studies conference called Mining Animals, and we're very enthused, and so many people talking about all this good work and blah, 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 blah. So we thought we'd be interested to know about the future of animal studies. So we ran the survey in 2015, and we also ran again in 2020. And so we're now starting to look at our new data, although we're yet to publish anything. So out of our first round of survey data, the 2015 data, we published 3 papers. One of them was on whether kind of meat eating among animal studies scholars. One of them was on why would anyone pursue a career in animal studies as an academic when our survey respondents were telling us that they felt it compromised their career opportunities? And a lot of people said, you know, they were mocked and belittled by colleagues and they couldn't get funding and blah, blah, blah. And then the third paper was called Pussy Panic, and it was about basically women in academia and their contribution to animal studies. And the Pussy Panic paper, I think, is perhaps the one that the person who asked the question was thinking of. It's available in the journal Australian Feminist Studies. And if you can't get a copy, I think it's probably behind a paywall. If you contact me, I'll send you a copy. So in that, basically what we look at is the extent to which women are contributing to the field of animal studies. And one of the things that we've noticed, but of course we're not by far not the first people to notice this, is that within animal protection organisation, there's a tendency for men to hold leadership roles and women to be the ones who are you know, get there early and set up for the meeting and stay back late and sweep the floor and provide the snacks in between. And, you know, we do see this unfortunately replicated in the academy where, you know, we went through and had a look at how, you know, in our survey, around 2/3 of the respondents were women. Yet when we had a look at how often women are asked to deliver keynote addresses at conferences, we found that it's overwhelmingly men who are invited. We had a look at anthologies of animal studies books, and we found that overwhelmingly there were male authors invited to contribute, although there is a trend towards that becoming more balanced. We also had a look at even my own podcasting data. And what happened in the case of that is that a colleague of mine, Peter Chen, who's also an animal studies scholar, he's at the University of Sydney, he had a podcast himself, which is now discontinued. But on International Women's Day, he went through and he counted all his guests and he put a post up on Facebook and he said, I've not had parity. I've interviewed more men than women. You know, this is not good enough. I'm going to have more women guests on. This is my pledge to the listeners. And I thought to myself, I wonder what I'd done. You know, I'd already been doing the podcast for a couple of years. I'd not been paying attention really. And I went back and I counted. And what I found was that I had done quite a good job with interviewing women. I had interviewed just, I think, slightly more women than men. So it was something like 52% women to men. Although as Fiona Proven-Ratsey did point out to me, because women tend to be about 2/3, the animal studies scholars actually hadn't done that well. But I was quite pleased with myself to have done 50%. But where I found something very interesting was I went and had a look at the download data. And that's how many people have downloaded each episode of my podcast. And even though I interviewed 50% of the guests had been women, listeners are much more likely to download an episode by a man. And so there's this, even within, you know, my podcast, there's this notion of men having this authoritative voice. And so one of the things we say in the paper is that it's a real challenge because we want animal studies to be, you know, an emerging field of research. We want it to be taken seriously. And so how do you get some people to take things seriously? Well, you get the men in to, you know, give it a gravitas. But of course, it's disingenuous and it's not fair to women scholars. So they're just some of the things that we talk about in the article. You know, I recommend it. I think it's quite an interesting read. As I say, I hope we're getting better, but, you know, it's tricky.
Cool, thanks. And also, Michael has put that article in the chat, and he says it doesn't look like it's behind a paywall.
Oh, well done. Wonderful.
There's a chance that it's, because I have access to the papers, so maybe I got through the paywall, but if you click that link, you should go through there.
If you didn't go through the library, chances are it doesn't have a paywall. Okay. Yeah.
Probably doesn't then, yeah. Cool. Okay. What are some things that you think the animal studies community has not done enough on? This is very broad because there's a lot of related fields to this, but what do you think you see as some of the major gaps in the research, or what do you think are some questions that you would like to see answered?
That's an interesting one. Well, look, in one sense, you know, we're only limited by our own imagination. There's an endless supply of research things we can do. What I will say, however, is that I'm a political scientist. I was trained as a political scientist, and now I'm a public policy specialist. And political scientists were very slow to the conversation. There was a huge reluctance among political scientists to examine animal questions, and there remains a reluctance among public policy scholars. There are very few public policy scholars who think about political issues from an animal's perspective. So I'm really heartened to see that changing. I'm really heartened to see, you know, someone like Will Kimlicka, who is a political philosopher of great international standing. He's now really dedicated to animal issues. I think he's basically publishing exclusively on politics and animals. So to see things like that, to see those changes occurring and that kind of opening up the field for more and more people to ask political questions about animals, I think is really important. I've also got colleagues in other disciplines who I think are trying to bring animals into the research equation in ways that, for me, is really exciting and interesting. So, for example, some of my colleagues, you know, Nick Taylor and Heather Fraser, they're both social workers, and they're doing work around thinking about animals as they pertain to gender violence, but not just thinking about how animals might make it more difficult for someone to leave a violent relationship, or might, you know, be a way in which a male perpetrator of gendered violence might harm the family by harming, say, the dog or whatever else, but encouraging us to think of these as actors, these animals as themselves victims of gender violence, and thinking about things such as, you know, one of the terrible things about gendered violence, and I cannot claim to be an expert at all, but I'm starting to learn a bit more about it, is, you know, when you live with someone who's violent and unpredictable, it's nerve-wracking. You're always on edge. You don't know if it's going to be today or tonight or later on tonight that the violence is going to occur. And that's hard for animals as well. Animals also don't appreciate unpredictability and not knowing if it's going to be violent today or not. And so they themselves are also, you know, they're not just a conduit or part of a way of thinking about violence against humans. They themselves are also subjects. And so Nick has been doing this other work around trying to design social science research methods that take the animal seriously, that don't just see animals as proxy for human this, that, and the other thing, but really try to empower the animals to themselves contribute their story in some way. And I mean, it's all very modern. I'm not completely across it, but it excites me. I think, you know, people are starting to think about animals in new and interesting ways. And, you know, I'm a social scientist, so of course I'm more au fait with the social sciences, but I think, you know, hopefully it's happening in a lot of places. Can you hear banging in the background? That's my cat. Tom. I've got a very naughty cat. Tom.
That's okay. Cool, thank you. Kramer?
Yeah. So I suppose this question is focusing on, I suppose, penalties for animal cruelty. And they're wondering, is this something that's sort of easy to increase? So like harsher punishments for animal cruelty, or is it, you know, the same as everything else in the sort of animal protection sphere?
Look, I think that's a really interesting issue. I think we have seen increases in penalties. I think there has been a willingness to apply harsher penalties to cases of animal cruelty. I think there has also been, you know, changes around the way that we manage animal cruelty that perhaps has made it easier for organisations like the RSPCA to do their work. So, for example, not everything needs to be a prosecution. People can be fined, and fines are efficient. You don't have to go to court. You don't have to invest in, you know, legal teams. You know, if you're caught spending, you get a fine. You don't go and stand before a magistrate every time. So I think there have been some improvements in that way. At the same time, though, I think that we need to be cautious about looking to incarceration as a solution to social issues. I mean, I think we're a long way off it, but, you know, in somewhere like the United States, where big sections of the community are kept in prison, I don't know that it makes the world a better place. I don't know if it makes that country a better place or a safer place. I think it would be preferable to work on the social mores around harm to animals and not necessarily to rely too much on the law and order, kind of beat the law and order drum too much. Just a word of caution.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, so this goes back to a point you made earlier about your the way you weight up, say, lives versus species protection. So the question is, if you were convinced that an endangered species going extinct would result in fewer individuals being killed, would you still want to ensure? Would you still want people to ensure that that species doesn't go extinct? So I guess maybe another way of asking this, it would be like if say for maybe resource allocation, limited resource allocation. If you had some amount of money that you could use to say prevent extinction of some endangered species versus saving more lives but not reducing species extinction, what would be your thought on that?
Look, I have to say I'm not completely sure I've understood the question, but I'm happy to speak more generally to the notion of, you know, how we weigh these things up. It's not clear to me that species is necessarily a hugely morally significant categorization. It may be, but it's not one that I would kill over. You know, to a certain extent, I mean, there's I think, you know, there's been some really interesting writing from people who are eco-feminists, for example. I think maybe Margaret Rose, perhaps. Or is it Margaret? I think I've messed up the name there. But I think there are, there are people who have confronted these very complicated issues, and I'm thinking of a person. She was at UNSW actually, and sadly she died fairly recently. I think her surname might be Rose. Anyway, I heard her speak a while ago about a property that she had bought, that she of course wanted it to be, you know, an oasis for native animals, and it was overrun with rabbits. And so then that puts you in a very challenging situation. And, you know, I have to admit, in my thinking about these issues, I've not myself had to deal with plagues. Actually, there's something interesting happening. Apparently the rats are getting very irritated in cities. They're not finding enough scraps at the moment. And there's a bit of a problem with the rat communities are unhappy. But I do wish to take these issues seriously, and I do understand why people are concerned for species, but I just cannot bring myself on the face of it to think that it's the kind of thing that we should kill over. That said, if we are concerned about species loss, if we really are concerned about species loss, then I think we need to start with our own behaviours. You know, if koalas matter greatly, then fine. No more development. We limit what we do to address those species issues. Where I think it becomes very problematic is what I see among some environmentalists, which is the solution to every environmental problem seems to involve, killing cats or killing foxes or killing this individual, killing that. Never involves humans or rarely involves humans. So what I'd say is, if a species is worth killing over, then let's not be specious in deciding who it is we're going to kill. And if we're going to go out and kill those who are a threat to a species, we include humans in the mix. And if we think that that's too harsh, then we should think about what it means for the other animals that don't get it, to make that decision. So, cats kill native animals. Well, humans are killing native animals, left, right and centre. So that's my position. And in one sense, it's very impractical, but I just really can't escape the notion that when we start off on our journey to deal with addressing species loss, we start from the perspective of targeting other individuals other than humans. And I think that that's morally problematic.
Great, thank you for that, Siobhan.
Okay, so that was the last question, but I might, maybe we can sort of end with a thought about the future. So I think you talk about this a bit in your book. So kind of the way that democratic systems recognize sort of their citizens and maybe the place of how animals should be placed sort of consistently with liberal democratic theory in these political systems. So how should these animals be treated if they were to be treated consistently with liberal democratic theory? So do you have any thoughts on that? So for instance, animals as citizens, or citizens in what sense, this sort of thing?
Yeah, so really the big thing that I call for that is very, very abstracted and theoretical, but nonetheless I would love to see, is that we take equitable treatment of animals seriously. And I guess it really relates to what I was just saying. What I find very problematic is this idea of, oh my goodness, there's such and such, possums under threat, let's kill all the cats. Oh, but wait a sec, didn't we just clear, all of Sydney? And, so I'm in favour of consistency. And so what I ask for is that one of the ways that we could make our treatment of animals more consistent with what we say we value as a liberal democracy is to treat them consistently. Now, what I mean by that is, yes, a consistency between species, but even within species groups. So there are all kinds of things that you can do to a rabbit in a research laboratory, a rabbit in a factory farm. You can't do it to a rabbit at home. And so I say, why don't we be consistent? Why should we have these laws that radically change how you are protected and what can be done to you just because of who owns you or the context you're in? It doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem to be consistent with, any kind of evidence-based policy approach, and nor does it seem consistent with liberal democratic values which profess to be committed to this equity principle. So I say one of the risks of that is, of course, it might invite a race to the bottom. We might decide, oh no, we really want to harm everyone. We want to have rabbit meat from factory farms, so therefore everyone at home will be able to also harm their rabbits in a similar way. But what I argue is that if we were to be consistent, it would give us the opportunity at least to be able to see what's going on and to argue for something better. And so it's also a way of getting around this invisibility. If we actually were able to see the suffering, if people were treating dogs at the dog park the same way dogs are treated in research laboratories, we would be positioned to decide if we support it or not. And if we don't support harmful treatment of animals, we can prohibit it. We have that available to us. That is within our legal rights, or within, that power is available to us. So that's kind of what I think about when I kind of come up with an idea of how we might include animals in political ways that might be both consistent with the principles we profess to support and may also benefit them. That said, there are lots of people doing really creative and interesting work around these issues, such as how to include animals as citizens, how to hear their voices more readily. You know, I've already mentioned Will Kimlicker. Alistair Cochrane is another important political scientist. He's at the University of Sheffield. He's just been writing about cosmopolitanism and should we think about animals as cosmopolitan. I mean, a lot of these people, I have to say, I've interviewed for my podcast. So if you don't feel you can be bothered reading the book, you can also listen to the audio. So, you know, Fiona's article, the article I wrote with Fiona Provan-Rapsey and Yvette Watt on Pussy Panic, that I've interviewed Fiona about that. I've interviewed Alistair quite a few times. So there is this really interesting political work taking place. It's always shifting and growing. As I said, my main contribution, I think, at the moment is to think about animal advocates, people such as yourselves, and what they bring to policy making. And I think what they bring is this social service of visibility, of making people aware of the issues so they can make an informed decision. And I think that's really valuable. And, you know, that's what I'm kind of focused. I'm focused on identifying a legitimate role or making evident, arguing for the legitimacy of the role animal advocates play in influencing policy making as it relates to animals. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so we might leave it at that. So thanks once again, Siobhan, for coming and talking and doing the Q&A. Thanks everyone for attending virtually. Also make sure to check out Siobhan's work, her podcast, Knowing Animals, her book, Animals Equality and Democracy, if you're interested in more on that. This will also be going up on YouTube probably later tonight, sometime soon. So feel free to share it around if you'd like. Okay, cool.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all your work, and I wish you all the very best, particularly for the local government elections. I'd love to see some of you on the local councils.
Thanks. Well, we'll see. Hopefully. Cool. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
See you.